Hey everybody, welcome back to our Luke deep dive. After spending the last couple of weeks investigating kind of the background, the context, authorship, audience, structure, and themes of Luke's gospel, we have finally arrived at actually jumping into the text. Today we are simply reading 4 verses. Chapter 1 of Luke, reading verses 1 to 4. If you haven't already, it might be a great time to pause this video and go back and just read those couple of verses. We're going to be doing that throughout these videos. So it's probably going to be helpful if you come into the videos having read the text, just because for the sake of time, I don't have time to read all of the text and then talk about it. And so it's going to be really helpful if you can read the text ahead of time. As we spend time explaining it, it'll hopefully make more sense and be more helpful to you. So Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4 is often titled the preface or the introduction, and it falls at the very beginning of Luke's gospel. You may remember that in the structure of Luke's gospel, we talked about there's 4 kind of basic structures. The first structure is basically the pre-introduction or qualification of Jesus. Then there's Jesus on his way, traveling around Galilee, and then there's Jesus on his way to Jerusalem, and then there's Jesus in Jerusalem. So those are the 4 main sections. This section is the kind of the qualifications for Jesus, and the whole section is really about why Jesus is qualified to be the Messiah, the promised one of God who's come to make all things right again. So we see from Luke chapter 1, 2, 3, and the beginning of 4, why Jesus is qualified to do the things that he's doing and to say the things that he's saying. And so this beginning falls in that section. So chapters 1 to 4 is kind of Luke's preface or introduction of what he is seeking to do in his gospel. We've talked about this a little bit already, but he basically says a couple of things. The main gist of these 4 verses is that Luke wants to write up his own account of the story of Jesus, and he's doing that for someone named Theophilus. Now, what does he mean by all of this? Well, if you have a look at verse 1, he says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of things that have been fulfilled among us." Right there, let's stop. The very first sentence in this introduction, Luke basically says that I know, you know, that many people have already put their hand to writing things about Jesus that have already happened. So that line, "many have undertaken to draw up an account," actually means put their hand to. So this is the reference that we talked about in previous weeks, that Luke, probably by the time he was writing his version of the gospel, there were already actually other written accounts of the gospel in circulation already. This could be a reference to the Gospel of Mark, which scholars think is the earliest written gospel. It could be just a mention of other gospels that had been written down, but we have since lost through time. But he references people who have already written down stories about Jesus. He then goes on in verse 2, he says, "just as they were handed down to us by those who were the first eyewitnesses and servants of the word." So now Luke says, I have investigated, there's people who have written down gospel stories about Jesus, and there are people who are still alive who have actually orally told us the stories about Jesus. So the first eyewitnesses and the people who, the apostles, the people who are serving Jesus after his death and resurrection. And so Luke's basically saying in those 2 sentences, I have received kind of these written sources, and I have gone and talked to all these people who were there with Jesus from the beginning, and I've heard directly from them the sort of things that have taken place. So he has kind of 2 main sources here that he is investigating. Verse 3, he says, "With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you. So again, Luke, in his own mind, says, I have access to these written sources. I've talked to all of these original eyewitnesses, and I have been curious about all of this stuff myself. And so I wanted to set out and write my own story of Jesus in an orderly account. That little phrase there, orderly account, is really important. Because if you read the Gospel of Luke and compare it to, say, Mark or Matthew in particular, you'll see that some of the same stories happen out of order. And you might scratch your head and think, well, why is that the case? Why is it that Jesus did this thing here, but then in Luke's gospel, he did it here after this event? And what Luke is trying to do, Luke doesn't say, I'm writing a chronological account for you, but an orderly account. What he means by that is simply Luke is kind of clumping the teachings and sayings of Jesus into kind of structures and themes that will highlight certain things as you move through the gospel. So Luke is not really interested in a chronological, like an exact chronological story of the timeline of Jesus, though he follows a basic chronology. It starts with the birth of Jesus, ends with the death and resurrection of Jesus, so chronologically that all fits. But he takes some of the stories and some of the teachings and parables, and he puts them in different order than we find in Mark or Matthew at times. And again, why he does this is because he wants to highlight certain themes or certain messages that he wants to get across. And so he's taking these things and rearranging the order of them so that you kind of understand the gist of what Jesus is really saying. He then concludes that this is for most excellent Theophilus. We already talked about who this guy could be. Most likely this guy was a new Christian, probably a Gentile Christian, maybe someone who even sponsored Luke to write this gospel, because it's really a long and expensive process back then. And so he might have commissioned Luke to write this for him. And so, or it could just be a name that means something different, which names in the Bible usually do that. So Theophilus simply means God lover in Greek. So it could be a general audience of new Christians as well. And then Luke says the purpose of this, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So Luke really wants to write this orderly account based on all these sources that he has received, so that the audience, whoever it is, whether it's Theophilus, whether it's a new group of Christian believers, or whether it's us today, that we may know the certainty of the things that we have been taught. So this, again, is a reminder that this is written to people that maybe are new to investigating who Jesus is. They don't know all the ins and outs. They don't know all the backstory. And so Luke arranges his story of Jesus in a certain way so that you are certain of the things that you're taught. You know that this is true and this is right and it makes sense. So that is Luke's introduction of his gospel account. From here, he dives straight into kind of the birth narratives of John the Baptist and Jesus, which we'll talk about very soon. But I think a great way to think about this opening section is that Luke is someone who really wants to get the truth about who Jesus is. Not necessarily in a chronological order, but he really wants to communicate to us, his audience, what is really true about Jesus. Who is he really? What is he on about? What does it mean to know him and be in a relationship with him? And so Luke arranges his gospel account so that those themes become very clear as you start to read, so that by the time you get to the end of Luke's gospel, you are certain that you know who Jesus is, what he is on about, and what it means to respond to him. So I'll leave you with that for today. Hopefully that's been an interesting start, and we'll jump into the rest of Luke chapter 1 next week. I'll see you later. Bye.